Meditations on First Philosophy by Rene Descartes. This is a modernized version of the 1853 translation in the public domain by Jonh Veitch. Dedication. To the very wise and illustrious, the Dean and Doctors of the Sacred Faculty of Theology of Paris. Gentlemen, the reason I am presenting this treatise to you is so reasonable, and when you learn of its purpose, I am confident that you will find it so compelling that you will agree it deserves your protection. The best way for me to recommend it to you is by briefly explaining the goal I had in mind when writing it. I have always believed that the two questions concerning God and the soul are the most important ones that should be addressed with the help of philosophy rather than theology. For although, as believers, it is enough for us to hold by faith that the human soul does not perish with the body and that God exists, it still seems impossible to convince non-believers of any religion, or even of moral virtues, unless we first prove these two things to them using natural reason. Since, in this life, vice often offers greater rewards than virtue, few people would choose what is right over what is useful if they were not restrained by the fear of God or the expectation of another life. Although it is true that the existence of God is to be believed because it is taught in the sacred scriptures, and the scriptures are to be believed because they come from God, since faith is a gift from God, and the same being who gives us the grace to believe other things can also give us the grace to believe in his existence. This reasoning cannot be presented to non-believers who would see it as circular logic. Indeed, I have noticed that you, along with other theologians, not only affirm that natural reason is sufficient to prove the existence of God, but also that it can be inferred from sacred scripture that the knowledge of God is much clearer than that of many created things, and that it is so easy to acquire that those who do not possess it are blameworthy. This is evident from the words of the Book of Wisdom, chapter 13, where it is said, "Howbeit they are not to be excused. For if their understanding was so great that they could discern the world and the creatures, why did they not rather find out the Lord thereof?" And in Romans, chapter 1, it is said that they are without excuse, and again in the same place, that which may be known of God is manifest in them. We seem to be reminded here that all which can be known of God can be made evident through reasons found within our own minds. Therefore, I thought it appropriate to inquire how and by what means, without going beyond ourselves, God may be more easily and certainly known than the things of the world. As for the soul, although many have thought that its nature could not be easily discovered, and some have even claimed that human reason leads to the conclusion that it perishes with the body, and that the contrary opinion can be held only through faith, nevertheless, since the Lateran Council, held under Leo X in Session 8, condemns these views and expressly enjoins Christian philosophers to refute their arguments and establish the truth as best they can, I have dared to attempt this in my work. Furthermore, I am aware that most irreligious people deny the existence of God and the distinctness of the human soul from the body, for no other reason than that, as they claim, these points have never been demonstrated. Now, although I do not share their opinion and, on the contrary, believe that almost all the arguments presented by great thinkers on these questions, when properly understood, have the force of demonstrations, and that it is nearly impossible to discover new ones, I still believe that one of the most valuable services that can be rendered in philosophy is for someone to carefully seek out the best of these arguments and explain them so accurately and clearly that it will be evident to all that they are indeed demonstrations. Finally, since many people who know that I have cultivated a certain method for solving all kinds of difficulties in the sciences, which is not new, since nothing is older than truth, and who are aware that I have successfully applied it in other cases, were eager for me to apply it to this subject as well, I felt it was my duty to give it a try. The sum of what I have accomplished on this subject is contained in this treatise. I did not attempt to collect all the various reasons that could be presented as proofs on this subject, because that does not seem necessary when there is at least one proof of sufficient certainty. Instead, I focused on the first and most important reasons and treated them in such a way that I now dare to propose them as demonstrations of the highest certainty and evidence. I also believe that these proofs are so strong that I think it is unlikely that any better ones will ever be discovered, given the importance of the subject and the glory of God, to whom all this relates. This compels me to speak more freely about myself than I am accustomed to. Nevertheless, no matter how certain and clear these demonstrations may be to me, I cannot persuade myself that they are accessible to everyone. Just as in geometry, there are many demonstrations by Archimedes, Apollonius, Pappus, and others that, while universally accepted as clear and certain, because they obviously contain nothing that is not very easy to understand in itself, and no conclusions that are not accurately related to their premises, are nevertheless understood by only a very limited number of people because they are somewhat lengthy and require the reader's full attention. In the same way, although I consider the demonstrations I use here to be equal or even superior to those in geometry in terms of certainty and clarity, I fear that they will not be adequately understood by many, primarily because they are also somewhat long and complex, and especially because they require the mind to be completely free from prejudice and able to detach itself from the influence of the senses. To tell the truth, the ability to engage in metaphysical studies is less common than the ability to engage in geometry. Moreover, there is this additional difference. In geometry, everyone believes that nothing is proposed without a certain demonstration, so those with limited knowledge are more likely to err by accepting falsehoods in their desire to appear knowledgeable than by rejecting truths. In philosophy, on the other hand, where everything is believed to be doubtful, few sincerely dedicate themselves to the pursuit of truth, and the majority seek the reputation of bold thinkers by audaciously challenging the most important truths. Therefore, no matter how strong my reasoning may be, I do not expect it to have much impact on people's minds simply because it belongs to philosophy, unless you extend your patronage and approval to it. But since your faculty is held in such high esteem by everyone, and since the name of the Sorbonne carries such authority, not only in matters of faith, but also in matters of human philosophy, that no other society, apart from the sacred councils, is regarded with such great respect, it is universally believed that nowhere else can greater clarity, solidity, wisdom, or integrity in judgment be found. I have no doubt that if you would be kind enough to consider this treatise, first by correcting it, for I am mindful not only of my human limitations but also of my ignorance, and I do not claim it to be free from errors, and then by filling in what is missing, perfecting what is incomplete, and providing more thorough explanations where needed, or at least by pointing out these defects to me so that I may strive to correct them. And finally, if the reasoning contained in it, by which the existence of God and the distinction of the human soul from the body are established, is brought to such a level of clarity that it can be considered an exact demonstration, which I am confident it can, if you then grant it the authority of your approval and publicly testify to its truth and certainty, I have no doubt that from that point onward, all errors that have ever been held on these questions will soon be erased from people's minds. For the truth itself will quickly persuade the rest of the insightful and learn to agree with your judgment, and your authority will compel the atheists, who are generally more superficial than insightful or learned, to abandon their spirit of contradiction. They may even begin to defend the reasoning they once opposed, simply because they see that all men of genius consider it a demonstration, and they do not want to appear as if they do not understand it. Finally, the rest of humanity will readily trust in so many testimonies, and no one will dare to doubt either the existence of God or the real distinction between mind and body. It is up to you, in your singular wisdom, to judge the importance of establishing such beliefs, as you are well aware of the disorders that doubt in these truths can cause. But it would not be appropriate for me to continue praising the cause of God and religion to you, who have always been the strongest support of the Catholic Church. Preface to the reader. I have briefly touched on the questions concerning the existence of God and the nature of the human soul in the discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and seeking truth in the sciences, which I published in French in 1637. However, my intention was not to treat these subjects fully at that time, but rather to introduce them in passing to gauge how readers might respond to them. These questions seem to me so important that they deserve to be considered more than once. The approach I take in discussing them is so unconventional and far removed from the usual paths that I thought it best not to elaborate on it too much in French, or in a discourse that might be read by everyone, in case less capable minds might think they could venture into this path themselves. But since in the discourse on method, I asked anyone who found faults in my writings to kindly point them out to me, I should mention that only 2 objections of note were raised against what I said on these topics. I will briefly address these objections before moving on to a more detailed discussion. The first objection is that, while the human mind, when reflecting on itself, does not perceive itself as anything other than a thinking thing, it does not necessarily follow that its nature or essence consists solely in being a thinking thing, excluding all other attributes that might also belong to the mind. To this, I reply that it was not my intention to exclude other attributes according to the true nature of the mind, which I did not discuss at that time, but rather according to the order of thought. My point was that, as far as I was conscious, I did not clearly understand anything as belonging to my essence except that I was a thinking thing, or a thing with the faculty of thinking. However, I will later show how the fact that nothing besides thinking belongs to the essence of the mind implies that, in truth, nothing else does belong to it. The second objection is that, just because I have the idea of something more perfect than myself, it does not necessarily follow that the idea itself is more perfect than I am, or that what is represented by the idea actually exists. My response is that the term idea is ambiguous here. It can be understood either materially, as an act of understanding, in which case it cannot be said to be more perfect than I am, or objectively, as the thing represented by that act, which, even if it is not supposed to exist outside my understanding, can still be more perfect than I am due to its essence. But I will explain more fully in this treatise how, from my possession of the idea of something more perfect than myself, it follows that this thing actually exists. Besides these two objections, I have also come across two lengthy treatises on this topic. However, in these works, my conclusions, rather than my premises, were challenged, and the arguments used against me were borrowed from the common arguments of atheists. Since such arguments will have no effect on those who properly understand my reasoning, and since many people are so irrational and weak-minded that they are more easily persuaded by the first opinions they hear, no matter how false or unreasonable, than by a true and solid refutation that comes later, I am reluctant to respond to these criticisms for fear that I would first have to present them. I will only say, in general, that all the arguments atheists usually bring up against the existence of God arise from one of two things: either attributing human emotions to God or giving our minds more strength and wisdom than they have, leading us to think we can determine and comprehend what God can and should do. Therefore, all that they allege will pose no difficulty, as long as we remember that our minds are finite while God is incomprehensible and infinite. Now that I have had some experience with how people respond to my work, I am taking up the task of discussing God and the human soul again, and, at the same time, exploring the principles of the entire first philosophy. However, I do not expect praise from the general public for my efforts, nor do I seek a wide readership. On the contrary, I advise that only those who are able and willing to meditate earnestly with me, who can detach their minds from the senses and free themselves from all prejudices, should read this work. Such individuals are, I know, remarkably rare. But for those who, without caring to understand the order and connection of the arguments, only study isolated statements to make trivial but noisy criticisms, as is common, I would say that such people will not gain much from reading this treatise. Even though they may find opportunities to quibble over certain points, they are unlikely to raise any significant objections that deserve a response. Since I do not claim to satisfy everyone on all these subjects at first glance, nor do I presume to have foreseen all the potential difficulties, I will first present in the meditations the considerations that have led me to what I believe is certain and evident knowledge of the truth. This will allow me to see whether the reasoning that has convinced me will also convince others. I will then respond to the objections raised by some individuals of great intellect and learning, to whom these meditations were sent for criticism before being published. These objections are so numerous and varied that I believe nothing significant will easily come to mind that hasn't already been touched upon. Therefore, I earnestly ask my readers not to make any judgments on the questions raised in the meditations until they have carefully read all the objections along with my replies. Synopsis of the 6 following meditations. First meditation. In the first meditation, I lay out the reasons why we can generally doubt everything, especially material objects, as long as the foundations of the sciences remain what they have always been. While the value of such broad doubt may not be immediately obvious, it is actually very useful. It frees us from all preconceived notions, helps the mind withdraw from the senses, and ultimately makes it impossible for us to doubt when we later discover the truth. Second meditation. In the second meditation, the mind exercises its unique freedom by assuming that no object exists if there is even the slightest doubt about its existence. However, it realizes that, in doing so, it must itself exist. This is a crucial point, as it allows the mind to easily distinguish what belongs to itself, that is, to its intellectual nature, from what pertains to the body. Some readers might expect at this point to see reasons proving the immortality of the soul. However, I must clarify that my goal was to write only what I could demonstrate precisely. I therefore followed an order similar to that used by geometers, where everything the proposition depends on is presented before drawing any conclusions. The first key to understanding the soul's immortality is forming the clearest possible concept of the soul itself, one that is entirely distinct from our notions of the body. This is explained in this meditation. It is also necessary to be certain that everything we clearly and distinctly think is true, but this cannot be fully established until the fourth meditation. Additionally, we need a clear concept of physical nature, which is partially given in this and later meditations. All these points lead to the conclusion that the mind and body are truly distinct substances, which is demonstrated in the sixth meditation. The absolute distinction between mind and body is further confirmed here by showing that while the body is divisible, the mind is indivisible. This distinction suggests that the mind is, by nature, immortal. Third meditation. In the third meditation, I present what I believe to be a strong argument for the existence of God. However, since I aim to avoid using comparisons from material objects to keep readers' minds away from the senses, there may still be some obscurities. These will, I hope, be clarified in the replies to the objections. For instance, it may be difficult to understand how the idea of a being absolutely perfect, found in our minds, contains so much objective reality that it must have a cause that is itself absolutely perfect. This is explained in the replies by comparing it to the idea of a highly perfect machine in the mind of a craftsman, where the objective perfection of the idea must have a cause, such as the craftsman's skill or that of someone else who provided the idea. Fourth meditation. The fourth meditation shows that everything we clearly and distinctly perceive is true and explains the nature of error. These points are essential both for confirming the previous truths and for understanding those that follow. It should be noted that I am not discussing sin, which is error in the pursuit of good and evil, but only the kind of error that occurs when determining truth and falsehood. I am also not referring to matters of faith or practical conduct, but only to speculative truths known through natural reason. Fifth meditation. The fifth meditation further illustrates the nature of physical things and presents a new proof for the existence of God. While this proof may not be entirely free of difficulties, the answers to these can be found in the replies to the objections. I also explain how even the certainty of geometrical demonstrations depends on the knowledge of God. Sixth meditation. Finally, in the sixth meditation, I distinguish between understanding and imagination, describing the marks of this distinction. The human mind is shown to be truly distinct from the body, yet so closely connected with it that they form a kind of unity. I review all the errors arising from the senses and suggest ways to avoid them. Finally, I provide reasons for believing in the existence of material objects, not because these reasons are crucial for proving that the world and our bodies exist, which no sane person seriously doubts, but because they demonstrate that these reasons are neither as strong nor as clear as those that lead to the knowledge of our minds and of God. My main aim in these meditations was to establish that the knowledge of our mind and God is the most certain and evident of all. Meditation I. Of the things of which we may doubt. Several years ago, I realized that from a young age, I had accepted many false opinions as true. Because of this, I became aware that much of what I believed was built on shaky foundations. From that moment, I knew that at some point, I would need to clear out all the opinions I had adopted and start fresh if I wanted to build a strong and lasting foundation for knowledge. But since this task seemed overwhelming, I waited until I was mature enough to take it on, thinking I wouldn't be better equipped at any later stage of life. That's why I've delayed it for so long. Now, I would be wrong to waste any more time thinking about it instead of taking action. Today, since my mind is free from distractions and I'm not disturbed by any strong emotions, and because I have the leisure to focus, I've decided to tackle the task of overthrowing all my previous beliefs. To do this, I don't need to prove that all of my beliefs are false. That might be impossible. But since my reason tells me that I should withhold belief from anything that isn't completely certain, just as much as I would from something obviously false, I can justify rejecting everything if I find any reason to doubt it. It won't be necessary to examine every belief individually. That would be an endless task. Instead, Just as the collapse of a building happens when its foundation is removed, I'll start by examining the principles on which all my former beliefs were based. Everything I've accepted as true up to this point has come from the senses, but I've noticed that the senses sometimes deceive us, and it's wise not to trust something that has misled us even once. However, someone might argue that while the senses can deceive us about small or distant things, there are still many things they tell us that are impossible to doubt, like that I'm sitting here by the fire, wearing a winter robe, holding this piece of paper. How could I deny that I have hands and a body, without being considered as insane as people who believe they are kings when they are actually poor, or dressed in gold and purple when they have no clothes at all, or whose heads are made of clay, or bodies of glass, or who think they are pumpkins? I'd be just as crazy as them if I based my decisions on such extreme examples. Even though this is true, I must remember that I'm human, and that means I sleep and dream. When I dream, I often imagine the same things, or even less likely things than what the insane believe when they're awake. How often have I dreamt that I was in these familiar circumstances, dressed and sitting by the fire, when in reality, I was lying in bed? At this moment, I certainly feel awake. I see this paper with open eyes. I'm moving my head. I'm purposefully extending my hand, and I feel it. Dreams don't seem as clear as this. But I can't forget that I've been deceived by similar illusions in sleep before, and when I think carefully about those times, I realize there's no sure way to distinguish being awake from dreaming. This realization leaves me amazed, and I almost convince myself that I might be dreaming right now. So let's suppose that I am dreaming, and that all these details, the opening of my eyes, the movement of my head, the stretching out of my hands, are just illusions. Let's even suppose that I don't actually have a body or hands like I see. Still, I must admit that the objects I see in dreams are like painted representations that must resemble something real. Therefore, the general objects, like eyes, a head, hands, and a body, are not entirely imaginary but represent real things. Even painters, when they try to depict fantastical creatures like sirens or satyrs, can't create something entirely new. They can only mix the features of different animals. Or if they imagine something entirely new and fictional, like nothing ever seen before, at least the colors they use are real. In the same way, even if these general objects like a body, eyes, a head, hands, and the like are imaginary, we must admit that there are some simpler and more universal objects, just like real colors, from which all the images in our minds, whether true or false, are formed. These simple and universal objects seem to include the basic nature of physical things and their extension, the shape of extended objects, their size or magnitude, and their number, as well as the place and time in which they exist, and other similar things. So we might be correct in concluding from this that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all the sciences that deal with complex objects are uncertain, but arithmetic, geometry, and the other sciences that focus only on the simplest and most general objects, without worrying about whether they actually exist, contain something certain and indubitable. Whether I'm awake or dreaming, it's still true that 2 plus 3 equals 5, and that a square has 4 sides. It seems impossible that truth so clear could ever be doubted. Still, I've always believed that there is an all-powerful God who created me as I am. But how do I know that He hasn't made it so there is no earth, no sky, no extended things, no shapes, no magnitude, no place, yet still causing me to perceive all these things as if they do exist? And further, since I sometimes think that others are mistaken about things they believe they know perfectly, how do I know that I'm not also deceived whenever I add 2 and 3, or count the sides of a square, or make any other simple judgment? But maybe God doesn't want me to be deceived, because He's supposed to be supremely good. However, if it goes against God's goodness to make me constantly deceived, it seems it should also be against His goodness to allow me to be deceived occasionally. And yet, it's clear that I am sometimes deceived. Some people might prefer to deny the existence of such a powerful being rather than believe that nothing is certain. But let's not argue about this right now and just assume that everything said about God is fictional. No matter how I came to exist, whether it was by fate, chance, an endless chain of events, or any other way, it's clear that the more imperfect the cause of my existence, the more likely it is that I could be deceived or make mistakes. And since being deceived and making errors are signs of imperfection, the less powerful or perfect the cause of my existence is, the more likely it is that I could be constantly deceived. I have no good counterargument to these thoughts, and I'm forced to admit that I can't be absolutely certain of anything I once believed to be true. This uncertainty isn't due to carelessness or lack of seriousness, but because of strong, carefully considered reasons. So, if I want to find something certain, I should be just as careful about avoiding belief in these opinions as I would be about avoiding belief in something that is clearly false. But it's not enough to just make these observations. I also need to remember them. My old, familiar beliefs keep coming back, taking up space in my mind, almost against my will, and influencing what I believe. I won't stop deferring to and trusting these beliefs as long as I continue to think of them as being somewhat doubtful, as I've shown, but still highly probable and more reasonable to believe than to deny. That's why I think it's not wrong if I deliberately decide to deceive myself by assuming, for a time, that all these opinions are completely false and imaginary. By doing this, I hope to counterbalance my old prejudices with new ones, so that my judgment won't be swayed by habit and will be able to find the path that leads to truth. I'm confident that there's no danger in this approach and that I can't be too skeptical right now since my goal is not action but knowledge. So, I'll suppose that it's not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some evil demon, powerful and deceitful, who has used all his tricks to deceive me. I'll imagine that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are just illusions, like those in dreams, that this demon has set up to trap me. I'll consider myself as having no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no blood, or any senses, and as falsely believing that I have all these things. I'll stay committed to this belief, and if I can't use this method to discover the truth, at least I can do what's within my power. I can suspend my judgment and firmly resist believing anything false or being tricked by this deceiver, no matter how powerful or cunning he may be. But this task is difficult, and a certain laziness pulls me back to my usual way of life. Like a prisoner who, while dreaming of freedom, starts to suspect that it's just a dream, but dreads waking up and works with the pleasant illusions to keep the dream going. I, too, willingly slip back into my old beliefs. I'm afraid to wake up from this slumber, fearing that the hard work and wakefulness that would follow will only bring more darkness, rather than the light of day, to overcome the difficulties I've raised. Meditation, too, of the nature of the human mind, and that it is more easily known than the body. Yesterday's meditation filled my mind with so many doubts that I can't shake them off. I don't see any clear way to resolve these doubts, and I feel like I've suddenly plunged into deep water. I'm so disoriented that I can't find solid ground or stay afloat. But I'll make an effort to continue on the path I started yesterday. That is, I'll keep rejecting anything that has even the slightest doubt, just as if I had discovered it to be completely false. I'll stay on this track until I find something certain, or at least until I know for sure that nothing is certain. Archimedes once said that he could move the entire earth if he had a firm and immovable point. In the same way, I can expect great things if I'm lucky enough to discover even one thing that's certain and undeniable. So, I'll assume that everything I see is false. I'll believe that none of the things my unreliable memory shows me ever existed. I'll assume I have no senses. I'll believe that my body, shape, extension, movement, and location are all just figments of my imagination. What, then, can be considered true? Maybe only this: that nothing is certain at all. But how do I know there isn't something entirely different from the things I just mentioned, something that's impossible to doubt? Isn't there a God, or some being, whatever name I might give it, who causes these thoughts to arise in my mind? But why suppose such a being? Maybe I'm capable of producing these thoughts myself. Am I not, at least, something? But earlier, I denied that I have senses or a body. So what follows from that? Am I so dependent on the body and the senses that I can't exist without them? But I've been convinced that there's absolutely nothing in the world. No sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Was I, therefore, also convinced that I don't exist? Far from it. I certainly existed since I was convinced. But there's something I don't know, some being with immense power and cunning, who constantly uses all his tricks to deceive me. Clearly, then, I exist, since I'm being deceived. And no matter how much this being deceives me, he can never make it so that I am nothing, as long as I'm conscious that I am something. So, after carefully considering everything, I must conclude that the proposition I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever I think it or conceive it in my mind. But I still don't know clearly what I am, even though I'm sure that I am something. So, I need to be careful not to mistakenly substitute something else for what I truly am and, as a result, stray from the truth, even in this knowledge that I consider to be the most certain and evident. For this reason, I'll now reconsider what I used to believe I was, before I started down this path of doubt. I'll strip away everything that can be doubted based on the arguments I've presented, so that only what's certain and undeniable remains. What did I used to think I was? I undoubtedly thought I was a human being. But what is a human being? Should I say a rational animal? Certainly not, because that would immediately lead to questions about what animal and rational mean, and I'd end up in a web of even more difficult questions. I don't have the leisure right now to waste time on such subtleties. Instead, I'll focus on the thoughts that naturally arise in my mind, inspired by my own nature when I think about what I am. First, I thought I had a face, hands, arms, and all the other parts of a body that appear in a corpse. I called this my body. I also thought that I was nourished, that I walked, perceived, and thought, and I attributed all these actions to my soul. But I didn't really consider what the soul itself was. Or if I did, I imagined it was something very rarefied and subtle, like wind, or flame, or ether, spread through my more solid parts. As for the body, I didn't even doubt its nature. I thought I knew it distinctly, and if I had tried to describe it based on my earlier beliefs, I would have said something like this. By body, I understand anything that has a specific shape, that occupies a certain place, and fills a certain space in such a way that it excludes every other body. Anything that can be perceived by touch, sight, hearing, taste, or smell, and anything that can be moved in different ways, not by itself, but by something else that touches it and imparts motion to it. For I didn't think that self-motion, perception, or thinking belonged to the nature of the body. On the contrary, I was somewhat surprised to find such abilities in some bodies. But now, what can I say that I am, since I'm assuming that there's a powerful, and perhaps malicious, being whose whole purpose is to deceive me? Can I claim that I possess any of the attributes that I previously thought belonged to the nature of the body? After carefully considering them, I find that none of these attributes truly belong to me. It would be pointless and tedious to go through them all again. So, let's move on to the attributes of the soul. The first I mentioned were the abilities to nourish and walk. But if it's true that I have no body, it must also be true that I can neither walk nor be nourished. Perception is another attribute of the soul, but perception, too, is impossible without a body. Besides, I've often believed, during sleep, that I was perceiving objects, only to realize later that I hadn't perceived them at all. Thinking, however, is an attribute of the soul, and here I find something that truly belongs to me. This alone is inseparable from me. I am, I exist, this is certain, but how often? Only as often as I think. For if I were to stop thinking entirely, I might also cease to exist. I now accept only what is necessarily true. So, strictly speaking, I am only a thinking thing, a mind, an intellect, a reason, terms whose meanings were previously unknown to me. I am, however, a real thing and truly exist. But what kind of thing? The answer, a thinking thing. The question now arises, am I anything more than that? I'll use my imagination to see if I'm not something more than just a thinking being. Clearly, I'm not the collection of body parts called a human body. I'm not a thin, penetrating air spread through all these parts, or wind, or flame, or vapor, or breath, or any of the things I can imagine. For I assumed that all these things didn't exist, and even without changing that assumption, I still find that I'm certain of my existence. But maybe it's true that the things I assume don't exist because they're unknown to me aren't actually different from the me that I know. This is something I can't determine, and I won't get into a debate about it right now. I can only judge things that I know. I'm aware that I exist, and as someone who knows that I exist, I'm trying to figure out what I am. It's completely certain that my knowledge of my own existence doesn't depend on things that I don't yet know exist. So, it doesn't depend on anything I might imagine. The very phrase, "I imagine," reminds me of my mistake because imagining is nothing more than contemplating the image or form of a physical thing. But I already know that I exist, and it's possible that all those images and everything related to the nature of the body are just dreams or fantasies. From this, I see that it doesn't make sense to say, "I'll use my imagination to know more clearly what I am," any more than it would to say, "I'm awake now and perceive something real, but because my perception isn't clear enough, I'll go to sleep so that my dreams can show me the object of my perception more truthfully and clearly." Therefore, I understand that nothing I can imagine belongs to the knowledge I have of myself. I need to carefully draw my mind away from this kind of thinking so I can clearly understand my own nature. But what, then, am I? A thinking thing. I've already said. But what is a thinking thing? It's something that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, imagines, and perceives. Surely, it's no small thing if all these properties belong to my nature. But why shouldn't they belong to it? Am I not the very being who now doubts almost everything, but still understands and conceives certain things? Who affirms one thing is true and denies others? Who wants to know more and doesn't want to be deceived? Who imagines many things, sometimes even against his will? And who also perceives many things as if through the senses? Isn't all of this as true as the fact that I am? Even if I'm always dreaming, and even if the one who created me uses all his tricks to deceive me? Is there any of these attributes that can be properly distinguished from my thought, or that can be said to be separate from me? It's so obvious that it's I who doubt, I who understand, and I who desire, that it doesn't need any further explanation to make it clearer. And I'm certainly the same being who imagines. Even if, as I supposed before, nothing I imagine is real, the power of imagination still exists in me and is part of my thought. Finally, I'm the same being who perceives, that is, who senses certain objects as if through the organs of sense, since, in reality, I see light, hear a noise, and feel heat. But someone might say that these perceptions are false and that I'm dreaming. So be it. But at least it's certain that I seem to see light, hear a noise, and feel heat. This can't be false, and this is what we properly call perceiving, which is nothing else but thinking. From this, I'm starting to understand what I am more clearly and distinctly than before. But still, it seems to me, and I can't help believing, that physical things, whose images are formed by thought and are examined by it, are known with much more clarity than this part of me that isn't imaginable. Although, in truth, it may seem strange to say that I know and understand more clearly things whose existence seems doubtful, that are unknown and don't belong to me, than things whose reality I'm convinced of, that are known to me, and belong to my own nature, in other words, myself. But I see clearly what's going on. My mind tends to wander and isn't yet willing to be restrained within the bounds of truth. So let's let the mind run free once more and allow it to consider all kinds of objects that seem to come from outside. Then, after gently and carefully withdrawing it from these and focusing it on the consideration of its own being and the properties it finds within itself, it might be easier to control. Let's now consider the objects that are commonly thought to be the most easily and distinctly known, namely, the bodies we touch and see. Not bodies in general, because these general ideas are usually somewhat more confused, but one specific body. Take this piece of wax, for example. It's fresh, having just been taken from the beehive. It still has the sweetness of the honey it contained and retains some of the smell of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are clear to the eye. It's hard, cold, easy to handle, and makes a sound when you tap it with your finger. In short, everything that makes a body as distinctly known as possible is found in this piece of wax. But if you put it near the fire, what's left of its taste evaporates, its smell fades, its color changes, its shape is destroyed, its size increases, it becomes liquid, it heats up, it can barely be handled, and if you tap it, it no longer makes a sound. Does the same wax still remain after this change? It must be admitted that it does. No one doubts it or thinks otherwise. So, What was it that I knew so distinctly in the piece of wax? Certainly, it couldn't be anything that I observed through the senses, since everything that appealed to taste, smell, sight, touch, and hearing has changed, yet the same wax remains. Perhaps it's what I now think, that the wax wasn't the sweetness of honey, the pleasant smell of flowers, the whiteness, the shape, or the sound, but only a body that appeared to me in those forms before and is now perceived in others. But to be precise, what is it that I imagine when I think of it this way? Let's carefully consider it, and after stripping away everything that doesn't belong to the wax, let's see what remains. There's certainly nothing left except something that's extended, flexible, and movable. But what do I mean by flexible and movable? Isn't it that I imagine the piece of wax, being round, can become square, or change from a square into a triangular shape? That's not the case, because I understand that it can undergo an infinite number of similar changes. And I'm also unable to fully grasp this infinity with my imagination. So this concept I have of the wax isn't the result of my imagination. But what, then, is this extension? Isn't it also unknown? Because it becomes greater when the wax melts, greater when it boils, and even greater when the heat increases. And I wouldn't understand the wax clearly and truthfully if I didn't suppose that the piece we're considering could undergo a wider variety of changes and extension than I ever imagined. So, I must admit that I can't even understand the wax through my imagination, and that it's only the mind that perceives it. I'm speaking about one piece of wax in particular, but this is even more evident when it comes to wax in general. But what is this piece of wax that can only be perceived by the mind? It's certainly the same thing that I see, touch, and imagine. In the end, it's the same thing that I believed it to be from the beginning. But, and this is important to note, the perception of the wax isn't an act of sight, touch, or imagination, and it never was, even though it might have seemed that way before. It's simply an intuition of the mind, which can be either imperfect and confused, as it was before, or very clear and distinct, as it is now, depending on how much attention is paid to the elements involved. However, I'm amazed at how weak my mind is and how prone it is to error. For even when I think about all of this silently, without saying a word, sometimes language gets in the way, and I almost get led into error by the terms of everyday speech. For example, we say that we see the same wax when it's in front of us, not that we judge it to be the same because it retains the same color and shape. From this, I might be inclined to conclude that the wax is known through sight, not through the mind's intuition alone, if it weren't for a similar case. When I observe people passing by in the street from a window, in this case, I don't hesitate to say that I see the people themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. But what do I see from the window besides hats and coats that might cover automata, whose movements could be controlled by springs? Still, I judge that they are human beings based on these appearances, and thus I understand through the faculty of judgment in my mind what I believed I saw with my eyes. Anyone who aims to achieve knowledge that goes beyond the ordinary should be ashamed to base their doubts on the common forms of speech. Instead of doing that, I'll continue with the matter at hand and ask whether I had a clearer and more perfect perception of the piece of wax when I first saw it and thought I knew it through my senses or imagination, or whether I understand it more clearly now after having examined it more carefully to see what it really is and how it can be known. It would be ridiculous to doubt this. For what was distinct in that initial perception? What did I perceive that any animal wouldn't have perceived? But when I distinguish the wax from its external forms, and when I consider it stripped of its outer layers, it's certain, although some error may still be found in my judgment, that I cannot understand it in this way without possessing a human mind. But finally, what can I say about the mind itself, that is, about myself? Because so far, I'm not admitting that I'm anything but a mind. What then? I, who seem to have such a clear understanding of the piece of wax, don't I know myself with even greater truth and certainty, and much more clearly and distinctly? For if I judge that the wax exists because I see it, it follows much more evidently that I exist for the same reason. It's possible that what I see may not actually be wax, and that I don't even have eyes with which to see anything, but it's impossible that I, who think I see, am nothing. Similarly, if I judge that the wax exists because I touch it, the same conclusion follows. I exist. And if I determine that my imagination, or any other cause, persuades me of the existence of the wax, I still reach the same conclusion. What I've said about the wax applies to all other things external to me. Furthermore, if the perception of the wax seemed more precise and distinct to me after being confirmed not only by sight and touch, but also by many other factors, how much more distinctly must I now know myself, since all the reasons that contribute to understanding the nature of wax, or any body, even better reveal the nature of my mind? And there are so many other things within the mind itself that illuminate its nature that those dependent on the body scarcely deserve to be considered. But in conclusion, I find that I've naturally returned to the point I was aiming for. Since it's now clear to me that bodies aren't truly perceived by the senses or by the imagination, but only by the intellect, and since they aren't perceived because they are seen or touched, but only because they are understood through thought, I realize that there's nothing more easily or clearly known than my own mind. However, because it's hard to quickly rid oneself of a long-held opinion, it would be wise to linger at this point for a while so that through continued meditation, I may imprint this new knowledge more deeply in my memory. Meditation 3. Of God. That He exists. Now, I'll close my eyes, block my ears, turn away my senses from their objects, and even erase from my mind all images of physical things. Or at least, because this is difficult, I'll consider them as empty and false. By doing this, I'll converse only with myself and closely examine my nature, trying to gain a more intimate and familiar knowledge of myself, step by step. I am a thinking being, a being who doubts, affirms, denies, knows a few things, and is ignorant of many, who loves, hates, wills, refuses, imagines, and perceives. As I noted earlier, even though the things I perceive or imagine might not exist outside of me or in themselves, I am still certain that the modes of consciousness I call perceptions and imaginations, as modes of consciousness, exist in me. In the little I've mentioned, I think I've summed up all that I truly know, or at least all that I was aware I knew until now. Since I'm trying to expand my knowledge further, I'll proceed cautiously and carefully consider whether I can discover anything more in myself that I haven't noticed before. I'm certain that I'm a thinking being, but do I also know what's required to make me certain of a truth? In this initial knowledge, there's nothing that assures me of its truth except the clear and distinct perception of what I affirm. But this wouldn't be enough to assure me that what I say is true if it were ever possible that something I clearly and distinctly perceived could be false. So, it seems to me that I can now accept as a general rule that everything I clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Yet, I previously accepted and believed many things as completely certain and obvious, which I later found to be doubtful. What were these things? They were the earth, the sky, the stars, and all the other objects I used to perceive through the senses. But what did I clearly and distinctly perceive about them? Nothing more than that the ideas and thoughts of those objects were presented to my mind. And even now, I don't deny that these ideas exist in my mind. But there was something else I also believed, that objects external to me existed, and that these ideas came from those objects and perfectly resembled them. I was mistaken in this belief, or if I judge correctly, it certainly wasn't due to any knowledge I had. But when I considered simple and easy matters in arithmetic and geometry, like that 2 and 3 added together make 5, didn't I view them with enough clarity to confidently affirm their truth? If I later judged that we should doubt these things, it was only because it occurred to me that God might have given me a nature that could be deceived even about the things that seemed most obviously true to me. But whenever this preconceived idea of God's supreme power comes to mind, I'm forced to admit that it's easy for Him, if He wants, to make me err, even in matters where I think I have the highest certainty. On the other hand, whenever I focus on things that I think I understand very clearly, I'm so convinced of their truth that I instinctively say things like, "Deceive me who may, no one will ever be able to make it so that I am not, as long as I'm conscious that I am," or make it true that I've never existed, given that it's now true that I exist, or make 2 and 3 add up to anything other than 5. In thinking such absurdities, I find a clear contradiction. In fact, since I have no reason to believe that God is deceitful, and since I haven't even considered the reasons that establish the existence of a God, any doubt based on this assumption is weak and, so to speak, metaphysical. But to completely remove this doubt, I must investigate whether there is a God as soon as I have the opportunity. And if I find that there is a God, I must also examine whether he could be a deceiver. Without knowing these two truths, I don't see how I could ever be certain of anything. And to examine this without disrupting the order of meditation I've planned for myself, namely, to gradually move from the notions I first find in my mind to those I discover later, I need to divide all my thoughts into certain categories and consider in which of these categories truth and error are most likely to be found. Among my thoughts, some are, as it were, images of things, and these alone are properly called ideas. Like when I think of a man, a chimera, the sky, an angel, or God. Others take on different forms, like when I will fear, affirm, or deny. In these cases, I still apprehend something as the object of my thought, but I also include in my thought something more than just the representation of the object. Thoughts of this kind are called volitions or emotions, and others are judgments. Now, with respect to ideas, if they're considered only in themselves and not referred to anything beyond them, they can't, strictly speaking, be false. Whether I imagine a goat or a chimera, it's equally true that I imagine one as much as the other. We also don't need to worry about falsity in the will or emotions, because even if I desire something wrong or that never existed, it's still true that I desire it. This leaves only our judgments, where we need to be very careful not to be deceived. The most common and significant error in judgments is assuming that the ideas in our minds resemble or correspond to things outside of us. For if we considered the ideas themselves as certain modes of our thought, without referring them to anything beyond, they would hardly ever lead us into error. But among these ideas, some seem to me to be innate, others to come from outside, adventitious, and still others to be made up by myself, invented. For example, the power I have to conceive of a thing, or a truth, or a thought seems to come from my own nature. But if I now hear a sound, see the sun, or feel heat, I've always judged that these sensations come from certain objects outside of me. And finally, it seems to me that sirens, hippogriffs, and similar creatures are inventions of my own mind. But I might eventually come to think that all my ideas are adventitious, or that they're all innate, or that they're all invented, for I haven't yet clearly discovered their true origin. What I need to do now is focus on those ideas that seem to come from objects outside of me and consider what grounds there are for thinking that they resemble those objects. The first reason is that it seems to me that nature teaches me this, and the second is that I'm aware that these ideas don't depend on my will, and therefore not on myself, because they often present themselves to me against my will. For example, right now, whether I want it or not, I feel heat, and I'm convinced that this sensation or idea of heat is produced in me by something other than myself, namely, by the heat of the fire I'm sitting next to. And it's very reasonable to think that this object affects me with its own likeness rather than anything else. But I need to consider whether these reasons are strong and convincing enough. When I say that nature teaches me something in this matter, I mean by nature only a certain natural impulse that pushes me to believe in a resemblance between ideas and their objects, not a natural light that gives me knowledge of the truth. These two things are very different. What the natural light shows to be true can't be doubted at all, like the fact that I exist because I doubt, and other truths like that. Since I have no other faculty to distinguish truth from error, nothing can convince me that what the natural light reveals as true is false, and the natural light is equally reliable. But when it comes to natural impulses, I've noticed, when deciding between right and wrong actions, that they often lead me to make bad choices. I don't see any better reason to trust them when it comes to truth and error. As for the other reason, that these ideas don't depend on my will, so they must come from objects outside of me, I don't find it more convincing than the first. Just as those natural impulses I just mentioned exist in me, even though they don't always align with my will, it's also possible that I have some power, which I don't fully understand, that's capable of producing ideas without the help of external objects. In fact, it's always seemed to me that ideas are formed during sleep by some power like this without any external aid. And finally, even if I were to grant that these ideas come from external objects, it doesn't necessarily follow that they must resemble them. On the contrary, I've noticed in many cases that there's a big difference between the object and its idea. For example, I have two very different ideas of the sun in my mind. One makes it appear extremely small, based on my senses, and should be classified as an idea that comes from outside. The other, which shows it to be much larger than the entire Earth, comes from astronomical reasoning, either from certain innate notions or something I constructed myself. These two ideas can't both resemble the same sun, and reason tells me that the one that seems to have come directly from the sun is the most unlike it. All of this shows that, so far, I've believed in the existence of things different from myself, which convey their ideas or images into my mind through the senses or other means, not because of a certain and deliberate judgment, but just because of a sort of blind impulse. But there's another way to investigate whether any of the objects whose ideas are in my mind exist outside of me. If I consider ideas only as modes of consciousness, I don't notice any difference or inequality among them, and they all seem to come from me in the same way. But when I think of them as images representing different things, it's clear that there's a great variety among them. Without a doubt, ideas that represent substances are something more and contain, so to speak, more objective reality, that is, they participate in higher degrees of being or perfection by representation than those that represent only modes or attributes. Furthermore, the idea by which I conceive of God, a sovereign being who is eternal, infinite, immutable, all-knowing, all-powerful, and the creator of everything outside of himself, certainly contains more objective reality than those ideas that represent finite substances. Now, it's evident by natural light that the total and efficient cause must contain at least as much reality as its effect. Where else could the effect get its reality if not from its cause? And how could the cause give it this reality unless it possessed it itself? Therefore, it follows that what exists cannot be produced by what doesn't exist, and also that the more perfect, in other words, that which contains more reality, cannot be the effect of the less perfect. This is true not only for effects whose reality is actual or formal, but also for ideas whose reality is considered only as objective. For example, a stone that doesn't yet exist can't begin to exist unless it's produced by something that possesses, formally or eminently, all the elements that make up the stone. In other words, it must be produced by something that contains the same properties that are in the stone, or something even superior to them. Heat can only be produced in a subject that was previously without it by a cause that is at least as perfect as heat. The same applies to other things. Moreover, even the idea of heat or a stone can't exist in me unless it's placed there by a cause that contains at least as much reality as I conceive to be in the heat or the stone. Although the cause might not transfer any of its actual or formal reality into my idea, we shouldn't think that it's less real because of this. Instead, we should consider that, as every idea is a work of the mind, its nature is such that it doesn't require any other formal reality than what it borrows from our consciousness, of which it's just a mode, that is, a way of thinking. But for an idea to contain this objective reality rather than that one, it must undoubtedly derive it from some cause that has at least as much formal reality as the idea contains of objective reality. If we suppose that there's anything in an idea that wasn't in its cause, then it must have come from nothing. But no matter how imperfect the mode of existence by which something exists objectively, or by representation, in the understanding through its idea, we certainly can't claim that this mode of existence is nothing, nor that the idea owes its origin to nothing. We also shouldn't imagine that, since the reality in these ideas is only objective, the same reality doesn't need to be formally, actually, in the causes of these ideas, but only objectively. Just as the mode of existing objectively belongs to ideas by their nature, the mode of existing formally belongs to the causes of these ideas, at least the first and primary cause, by their nature. And although one idea can give rise to another idea, this regression can't go on forever. We must eventually reach a first idea whose cause is like an archetype in which all the reality or perfection that's found objectively or by representation in these ideas is contained formally and in action. So, I'm clearly taught by natural light that ideas exist in me as pictures or images that may, in truth, fall short of the perfection of the objects they're based on, but can never contain anything greater or more perfect. And the more time and care I spend examining all these matters, the more clearly and distinctly I'm convinced of their truth. So, what conclusion should I draw from all of this? It's this: if the objective reality, or perfection, of any of my ideas is so great that it convinces me that this reality doesn't exist in me either formally or eminently, and if, as a result, I can't be the cause of that idea, then it necessarily follows that I'm not alone in the world. There must be another being that exists as the cause of that idea. On the other hand, if no such idea is found in my mind, I'll have no sufficient reason to be sure of the existence of any other being besides myself, because, despite careful searching, I haven't found any other basis for such a belief. Among my ideas, besides the one that represents myself, there's one that represents God, others that represent physical and inanimate things, others that represent angels, others that represent animals, and finally, some that represent humans like myself. As for the ideas that represent other humans, animals, or angels, I can easily suppose that they were formed by combining and mixing the other ideas I have of myself, physical things, and God, even though those beings may not exist outside of me. Regarding the ideas of physical objects, I've never found anything so great or excellent in them that I couldn't have created them myself. When I closely examine these ideas, one by one, in the same way I examined the idea of wax yesterday, I find very little in them that's clearly and distinctly perceived. In the category of things that are clearly understood, I recognize the following: size or extension in length, breadth, and depth; shape, which results from the boundaries of extension; position, which different shapes maintain in relation to each other; and motion, or the change of position. We can also add substance, duration, and number to this list. But when it comes to light, colors, sounds, smells, tastes, heat, cold, and other tactile qualities, they're thought of with so much obscurity and confusion that I can't even tell whether they're true or false. In other words, whether or not the ideas I have of these qualities are truly ideas of real objects. Although I previously said that formal falsity, or falsity in the strict sense, can only be found in judgments, there may still be a kind of material falsity in ideas, which occurs when they represent something that doesn't exist as if it were real. For example, the ideas I have of cold and heat are so unclear and indistinct that I can't tell whether cold is just the absence of heat, or heat the absence of cold, or whether they're real qualities or not. And since all ideas are like images that seem to represent some object, the idea that represents cold as something real and positive could be called false if it's correct to say that cold is nothing but the absence of heat, and this applies to other cases too. For ideas of this kind, it's not necessary to assign any cause other than myself, because if they're false, meaning they represent unreal objects, natural reason tells me that they come from nothing. That is, they're in me only because something is lacking in my nature. But if these ideas are true, yet present so little reality that I can't even distinguish the object represented from non-being, I don't see why I couldn't be their author. When it comes to the ideas of physical things that are clear and distinct, some of them, it seems to me, could have come from the idea I have of myself, such as the ideas of substance, duration, number, and the like. For instance, when I think of a stone as a substance, or something that can exist by itself, and think of myself as a substance too, though I conceive of myself as a thinking and non-extended thing, while the stone is extended and unconscious, making these two concepts very different, they both seem to share the common quality of representing substances. Similarly, when I think of myself as existing now and remember that I existed some time ago, and when I'm aware of various thoughts whose number I know, I then acquire the ideas of duration and number, which I can later apply to as many objects as I want. Regarding the other qualities that make up the ideas of physical objects, such as extension, shape, position, and motion, it's true that they're not formally in me, since I'm just a thinking being. But because they're only certain modes of substance, and because I myself am a substance, it seems possible that they could be contained in me immanently. This leaves only the idea of God, which I must consider to see if there's anything in it that can't be supposed to originate from myself. By the name God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, unchanging, independent, all-knowing, all-powerful, and the creator of myself and everything else that exists, if anything else does exist. These attributes are so great and excellent that the more carefully I consider them, the less convinced I am that the idea I have of them could have come from myself alone. Therefore, it's absolutely necessary to conclude, from everything I've said before, that God exists. For even though the idea of substance is in my mind because I'm a substance, I wouldn't have the idea of an infinite substance, since I'm a finite being, unless it were given to me by some substance that is truly infinite. And I shouldn't imagine that I don't grasp the infinite through a true idea, but only by denying the finite, in the same way that I understand rest and darkness by denying motion and light. On the contrary, I clearly perceive that there's more reality in an infinite substance than in a finite one, and therefore, in some way, I have the perception of the infinite before the finite. In other words, I have the perception of God before I have the perception of myself. For how could I know that I doubt, desire, or lack something, and that I'm not completely perfect, if I didn't have the idea of a being more perfect than myself, by comparing myself to which I recognize the deficiencies in my nature? And it can't be said that this idea of God is perhaps materially false and therefore could have arisen from nothing, in other words, that it might exist in me because of my imperfections, as I previously said about the ideas of heat and cold and similar things. On the contrary, because this idea is very clear and distinct and contains more objective reality than any other idea, there can be no idea more true or less open to the suspicion of falsity. The idea of a supremely perfect and infinite being is, in the highest degree, true. For even though we might imagine that such a being doesn't exist, we still can't suppose that the idea of this being represents nothing real, as I've already said about the idea of cold. The idea is also clear and distinct in the highest degree, since whatever the mind clearly and distinctly conceives as real or true, and as implying any perfection, is entirely contained in this idea. And this remains true even though I don't fully comprehend the infinite, and even though there may be an infinity of things in God that I can't understand or even grasp with my thoughts. After all, it's in the nature of the infinite that it shouldn't be comprehended by the finite. It's enough that I understand this correctly and recognize that everything I clearly perceive, and everything that I know contains some degree of perfection, and perhaps also an infinity of other properties that I'm ignorant of, exists formally or immanently in God. This understanding makes the idea I have of God the truest, clearest, and most distinct idea in my mind. But perhaps I'm more than I think I am, and maybe all the perfections I attribute to God exist in me in some potential form, even if they haven't yet manifested themselves or been fully realized. Indeed, I'm already aware that my knowledge is gradually increasing and improving, and I see nothing to prevent it from continuing to grow indefinitely. There's also no reason why, after this increase and improvement, I couldn't acquire all the other perfections of the divine nature. Finally, there's no reason why the potential power I have to acquire these perfections, if it truly exists in me now, shouldn't be enough to produce the ideas of them. Yet, when I examine the matter more closely, I realize this can't be the case. First, even if it were true that my knowledge increases daily in degrees of perfection, and even if there's much in my nature that's only potentially, not actually, present, none of these excellences make the slightest approach to the idea I have of God, in whom there's no potential perfection. All perfections exist actually. In fact, the fact that my knowledge increases gradually is a clear sign of its imperfection. Moreover, even if my knowledge continues to grow, I'm not led to think it will ever be actually infinite, since it can never reach a point where it's incapable of further growth. But I conceive of God as actually infinite, so nothing can be added to his perfection. Finally, I can easily see that the objective being of an idea can't be produced by something that only exists potentially, which, properly speaking, is nothing, but only by something that exists formally or actually. And truly, there's nothing in everything I've said so far that isn't easy for anyone to understand by natural reason if they think about it carefully. But when I allow my attention to relax a bit, the vision of my mind becomes obscured and almost blinded by images of physical objects, and I don't readily remember why the idea of a being more perfect than myself must necessarily come from a being that's actually more perfect. Because of this, I want to investigate further whether I, who possess this idea of God, could exist if there were no God. I ask myself, where could I have come from in that case? Perhaps from myself, or from my parents, or from some other causes less perfect than God, since anything more perfect than God, or even equal to God, can't be conceived or imagined. But if I were independent of any other existence and were the author of my own being, I wouldn't doubt anything, I wouldn't desire anything, and I wouldn't lack any perfection. For I would have given myself every perfection I could imagine, and in that case, I would be God. And it shouldn't be thought that what I currently lack is perhaps harder to acquire than what I already possess. On the contrary, it's obvious that it was much more difficult for me, a thinking being, to come into existence from nothing than it would be for me to acquire knowledge of the many things I'm currently ignorant of, which are merely attributes of a thinking substance. Certainly, if I had created myself and possessed the greater perfection I've just mentioned, in other words, if I were the author of my own existence, I wouldn't have denied myself the things that are easier to obtain, like the infinite variety of knowledge I currently lack. I couldn't have denied myself any of the properties that I perceive to be part of the idea of God, because none of them seem harder to make or acquire. And if any of these properties were harder to acquire, they would certainly seem that way to me if I were the source of everything else I possess, because they would reveal the limits of my power. Even if I were to suppose that I've always existed as I do now, I still couldn't escape the force of this reasoning, since it wouldn't follow, even on this assumption, that no author of my existence needs to be sought. The whole span of my life can be divided into an infinite number of parts, each of which is independent of the others. So, just because I existed a short time ago doesn't mean I must exist now, unless some cause is constantly recreating me, as it were, or conserving me. In truth, it's perfectly clear and evident to anyone who carefully considers the nature of duration that the conservation of a substance at each moment of its duration requires the same power and action that would be needed to create it if it didn't yet exist. So, it's a clear dictate of natural reason that conservation and creation differ only in our way of thinking, not in reality. All I need to do now is ask myself whether I possess any power by which I can ensure that I, who exist now, will continue to exist a moment later. Since I'm just a thinking thing, or at least, since we're currently only discussing that part of me, if such a power existed in me, I would undoubtedly be aware of it. But I'm aware of no such power, and this clearly shows that I depend on some being other than myself. But perhaps the being I depend on isn't God, and I was created either by my parents or by some other causes less perfect than God. This can't be, because, as I've said before, it's perfectly clear that the cause must have at least as much reality as the effect. Since I'm a thinking being and possess within myself the idea of God, whatever the cause of my existence may be, it must also be a thinking being and possess within itself the idea and all the perfections I attribute to God. Then we can ask again whether this cause is self-existent or was created by another cause. If it's self-existent, it follows from what I've already said that this cause is God. Since it possesses the perfection of self-existence, it must also, without a doubt, possess every other perfection contained in the idea of God. But if it owes its existence to another cause, we must again ask whether this second cause exists on its own or through something else, until we eventually reach an ultimate cause, which will be God. It's clear that in this matter, there can't be an infinite regress of causes, since the question isn't so much about the cause that once produced me as it is about the cause that is presently conserving me. And it can't be supposed that several causes work together to create me, with one giving me the idea of one of the perfections I attribute to God and another giving me the idea of a different perfection, leading to the conclusion that all these perfections exist somewhere in the universe, but not all together in a single being who is God. On the contrary, the unity, simplicity, or inseparability of all the properties of God is one of the main perfections I conceive him to have. The idea of this unity of all God's perfections couldn't be placed in my mind by any cause that didn't also give me the ideas of all the other perfections, because no power could enable me to grasp them as an inseparable unity without at the same time giving me the knowledge of what they are and that they exist in a specific way. Finally, regarding my parents, from whom it appears I came, even if everything I believe about them is true, it doesn't follow that they're the ones preserving me or even that they produced me as a thinking being. At most, all they contributed to my origin was giving certain dispositions to the matter in which I've previously believed that I, or my mind, which I now consider to be my true self, was contained. Therefore, there's no difficulty regarding them, and it's absolutely necessary to conclude from this alone that I exist and have the idea of a being that is absolutely perfect, which is God, and that his existence is clearly demonstrated. The only question that remains is how I receive this idea from God. I didn't get it from the senses, Nor is it presented to me unexpectedly like the ideas of physical objects that appear to be presented to the external organs of the senses. It's not even a pure creation or invention of my mind, because it's not within my power to add to or take away from it. So, the only option left is that it's innate, just like the idea of myself. And truly, it's not surprising that God, at my creation, implanted this idea in me to serve as a kind of mark of the Creator imprinted on His work. It's also not necessary that this mark be something different from the work itself. Considering that God is my Creator, it's very likely that He somehow shaped me in His own image and likeness, and that I perceive this likeness, which contains the idea of God, through the same faculty by which I understand myself. In other words, when I reflect on myself, I not only find that I am an incomplete, imperfect, and dependent being who constantly strives for something better and greater than I am, but at the same time, I'm also assured that the one on whom I depend possesses within himself all the goods I aspire to and the ideas of which I find in my mind. Moreover, these perfections exist not merely indefinitely or potentially, but infinitely and actually, and He is thus God. The entire strength of the argument I've used here to establish the existence of God lies in this: that I perceive I couldn't possibly be the kind of being I am and still have the idea of God in my mind if God didn't actually exist. This God, whose idea is in my mind, is a being who possesses all those great perfections that the mind can have some small understanding of, though it can't fully comprehend them, and who is completely free from any defect or imperfection. This makes it clear that He can't be a deceiver, because natural reason dictates that all fraud and deception come from some defect. But before I examine this more closely and move on to consider other truths that might be derived from it, I think it's appropriate to pause here for a while and contemplate God Himself, to reflect at leisure on His marvelous attributes, and to behold, admire, and adore the beauty of this light, which is so unspeakably great, as much as the strength of my mind, which is somewhat dazzled by the sight, will allow. Just as we learn through faith that the supreme happiness of the afterlife consists solely in the contemplation of the divine majesty, so even now we learn from experience that this kind of meditation, though far less perfect, is the source of the highest satisfaction we can experience in this life. Meditation 4. Of Truth and Error. Over the past few days, I've gotten used to detaching my mind from the senses, and I've carefully observed that there's very little we can know for certain about physical objects. We know much more about the human mind, and even more about God Himself. So now, I can easily focus my mind away from contemplating sensible or imaginable objects and direct it toward those that are purely intelligible, free from any connection to matter. And certainly, the idea I have of the human mind as a thinking thing, not extended in length, breadth, and depth, and not sharing any of the properties of a body, is incomparably clearer than the idea of any physical object. When I consider that I doubt, which means I'm an incomplete and dependent being, the idea of a complete and independent being, God, comes to my mind with such clarity and distinctness. From the mere fact that I have this idea, or that I exist to have it, I conclude that God exists and that my own existence at every moment absolutely depends on Him. These conclusions are so evident that I believe it's impossible for the human mind to know anything more clearly or certainly. And now I seem to have found a path that will lead from contemplating the true God, in whom all the treasures of science and wisdom are contained, to the knowledge of other things in the universe. First of all, I discover that it's impossible for God ever to deceive me because all fraud and deceit involve some kind of imperfection. Although it might seem that the ability to deceive shows cleverness or power, it's clear that the will to deceive shows malice and weakness, and these cannot be found in God. Next, I'm aware that I have a certain faculty of judgment, which I undoubtedly received from God, along with everything else that's mine. And since it's impossible for Him to will to deceive me, it's equally certain that He hasn't given me a faculty that would ever lead me into error, provided I use it correctly. There would be no doubt about this if it didn't seem to imply that I could never be deceived. If everything I have comes from God, and if He didn't give me any faculty that's deceitful, it seems to follow that I could never make a mistake. Accordingly, it's true that when I think only of God, when I view myself as coming from God, and turn entirely to Him, I find in myself no cause of error or falsehood. But as soon as I turn back to myself, experience shows me that I'm still subject to countless errors. When I investigate the cause of these errors, I see that there's not only a real and positive idea of God or a supremely perfect being in my mind, but also, so to speak, a certain negative idea of nothingness or of something infinitely distant from all kinds of perfection. I am, as it were, a middle ground between God and nothingness, positioned between absolute existence and non-existence. So that, on the one hand, there's nothing in me that could lead me into error, as long as I recognize that an absolute being is my creator. But, on the other hand, because I also share in some degree of nothingness or non-being, in other words, because I'm not the supreme being and I lack many perfections, it's not surprising that I should make mistakes. I thus see that error, so far as error is not something real, doesn't depend on God for its existence, but is simply a defect. Therefore, it's not necessary for God to have given me a faculty specifically designed for making mistakes. Rather, my being deceived arises from the fact that the power God gave me to discern truth from error isn't infinite. But this still isn't quite satisfactory. Error isn't just a pure negation, in other words, it's not simply a lack of some knowledge that isn't due to me. It's the absence or lack of some knowledge that I seem to think I should have. Considering the nature of God, it seems impossible that He could have created a faculty in me that's not perfect in its kind, that is, that lacks some perfection that's due to it. For if it's true that the more skilled the maker, the greater the perfection of the work, what could have been produced by the supreme creator of the universe that isn't absolutely perfect in all its parts? And there's no doubt that God could have created me in such a way that I would never be deceived. It's also certain that He always wills what is best. So, is it better for me to be capable of being deceived than not? As I think about this more carefully, the first thing that occurs to me is that I shouldn't be surprised if I'm not always capable of understanding why God acts as He does. Nor should I doubt His existence just because I may not understand why or how He created certain things. Knowing already that my nature is extremely weak and limited and that God's nature is immense, incomprehensible, and infinite, I no longer have any difficulty seeing that there are infinitely many things within His power whose causes are beyond my understanding. This consideration alone is enough to convince me that the whole class of final causes is of no use in explaining physical or natural things, for it seems to me that without risking arrogance, I shouldn't try to discover the hidden purposes of God. It also occurs to me that we shouldn't judge the perfection of God's works by looking at any one creature in isolation from the others, but by considering all His creatures together. The same thing that might reasonably be considered highly imperfect, if it were the only thing in the world, could be the most perfect thing possible when viewed as part of the whole universe. And although, because I intended to doubt everything, I only know for certain my own existence and that of God, nevertheless, after considering the infinite power of God, I can't deny that He may have produced many other objects, or at least that He is capable of producing them. So I may occupy a place as part of the great whole of His creatures. Looking more closely at myself and considering what my errors are, which are the only signs of imperfection in me, I observe that these errors depend on the interaction of two causes: the faculty of knowing, which I possess, and the faculty of choosing, or the power of free will, in other words, the understanding and the will. By the understanding alone, I neither affirm nor deny anything. I merely perceive the ideas regarding which I may form a judgment, and strictly speaking, no error is found in it. Although there are perhaps countless objects in the world of which I have no idea in my understanding, it can't be said that I'm deprived of those ideas as if they were something due to my nature. Rather, I simply don't have them, because there's no reason to believe that God should have given me a larger faculty of knowing than He actually did. No matter how skillful a creator we think God is, there's no reason to believe that He was obligated to give each of His creations all the perfections He's capable of giving to some. Nor can I complain that God hasn't given me freedom of choice or a will that's ample and perfect enough, since I'm truly aware of having a will so broad and extensive that it seems to surpass all limits. What strikes me as particularly remarkable here is that, of all the other faculties I possess, none are so great and perfect that I don't clearly see how they could be even greater and more perfect. For example, if I consider the faculty of understanding that I have, I find that it's very limited and restricted, and at the same time, I can form the idea of another faculty of the same kind, much broader, and even infinite. The very fact that I can form this idea shows me that it pertains to the nature of God. Similarly, if I examine my memory, imagination, or any other faculty I possess, I find that none of them are not small and circumscribed, while in God they are vast and infinite. But when it comes to the faculty of will, or freedom of choice, I find it so great that I can't conceive of anything more ample or extended. It's primarily through my will that I realize I bear a certain image and likeness of God. For although the faculty of will is incomparably greater in God than in me, both in terms of the knowledge and power that accompany it, making it stronger and more effective, and in terms of its scope, since it extends to a greater number of things in God, it still doesn't seem to me to be greater when considered in itself, formally and precisely. For the power of will consists only in this, that we can either do or not do the same thing, that is, affirm or deny, pursue or avoid it, or rather in this alone, that in affirming or denying, pursuing or avoiding what is proposed to us by the understanding, we act in such a way that we're not conscious of being compelled to a particular action by any external force. To have freedom, it's not necessary that I be equally indifferent toward each of two opposing choices. On the contrary, the more I'm inclined toward one. Whether because I clearly know it's true and good or because God internally disposes my thoughts, the more freely I choose and embrace it. And certainly, divine grace and natural knowledge, far from diminishing liberty, actually increase and strengthen it. But the indifference I feel when I'm not swayed to one side or the other due to a lack of reason is the lowest grade of liberty and reveals a deficiency or absence of knowledge rather than a perfection of will. For if I always clearly knew what was true and good, I'd never have any difficulty in deciding what judgment to make and what choice to pursue, and I'd be entirely free without ever being indifferent. From all this, I see that neither the power of willing, which I've received from God, is in itself the source of my errors, because it's exceedingly broad and perfect in its kind, nor is the power of understanding, because I can conceive of no object except through the faculty that God gave me. Everything I conceive is, without a doubt, rightly conceived, and it's impossible for me to be deceived in it. So where do my errors come from? They arise from this alone, that I don't keep my will, which extends much farther than my understanding, within the same limits. Instead, I extend it even to things I don't understand. Since the will is in itself indifferent to such things, it easily falls into error and sin by choosing the false instead of the true, and evil instead of good. For example, when I recently considered whether anything really existed in the world and found that because I was considering this question, it clearly followed that I myself existed, I couldn't help but judge that what I so clearly conceived was true. This wasn't because any external cause forced me to this judgment, but simply because the great clarity of the understanding was followed by a strong inclination of the will, and I believed this more freely and spontaneously the less indifferent I was about it. But now I not only know that I exist as a thinking being, but a certain idea of physical nature also presents itself to my mind. So, I'm in doubt as to whether the thinking nature within me, or rather that I myself am, is different from that physical nature, or whether both are simply one and the same thing. Here, I suppose that I still don't know of any reason that would determine me to adopt one belief over the other. As a result, it's a matter of complete indifference to me whether I affirm or deny either of these two suppositions, or whether I form any judgment about them at all. This indifference extends not only to things of which the understanding has no knowledge but also, in general, to all things that it doesn't perceive with perfect clarity at the moment the will is deliberating on them. For, however probable the conjectures may be that incline me to form a judgment on a particular matter, the simple knowledge that these are merely conjectures and not certain and indubitable reasons is enough to lead me to form a judgment that's directly the opposite. I recently had ample experience of this when I dismissed as false everything I had previously held as true, simply because I could, to some extent, doubt it. But if I refrain from judging something when I don't conceive of it with sufficient clarity and distinctness, it's clear that I act rightly and am not deceived. However, if I decide to affirm or deny, then I'm not using my free will correctly. If I affirm something false, it's evident that I'm deceived. Even if I judge according to the truth, I arrive at it by chance and don't escape the charge of misusing my freedom, because it's a dictate of natural reason that the knowledge of the understanding should always precede the determination of the will. And it's this misuse of the freedom of the will that constitutes the privation that forms the essence of error. Privation, I say, is found in the act, insofar as it proceeds from me, but it doesn't exist in the faculty that I received from God, nor even in the act itself, insofar as it depends on Him. For I certainly have no reason to complain that God didn't give me a greater power of understanding or more perfect natural light than He actually did, since it's in the nature of a finite understanding not to comprehend many things, and in the nature of a created understanding to be finite. On the contrary, I have every reason to thank God, who owed me nothing, for giving me all the perfections I possess, and I should be far from thinking that He's unjustly deprived me of or withheld the other perfections He hasn't given me. I also have no reason to complain that He gave me a will more extensive than my understanding, since the will consists of only a single element, which is indivisible. It seems that this faculty is of such a nature that nothing could be taken away from it without destroying it. And certainly, the more extensive it is, the more reason I have to thank the goodness of the one who gave it to me. Finally, I shouldn't complain that God collaborates with me in forming the acts of will or judgments in which I might be mistaken, because those acts are entirely true and good insofar as they depend on God. The ability to make those judgments is a higher degree of perfection in my nature than the absence of that ability would be. As for the privation, which is the actual source of error and sin, this doesn't require God's involvement because it isn't something real. If we refer to God as the cause of privation, it wouldn't be correct to call it privation but rather negation, according to how these terms are used in philosophy. It's not an imperfection in God that He gave me the ability to either assent to or withhold my judgment from certain things without giving me a clear and distinct understanding of them. The imperfection lies in me, in my failure to use my freedom correctly, in my tendency to readily pass judgment on matters that I understand only obscurely and confusedly. I realize, however, that it would have been easy for God to have made me in such a way that I'd never be deceived, even though I'd still have freedom and limited knowledge. This could have been done either by giving my understanding a clear and distinct knowledge of everything I'd ever need to deliberate on, or simply by engraving so deeply in my memory the resolution to never make judgments without a clear and distinct understanding that I'd never forget it. And I easily understand that, when I consider myself as a single whole, without reference to any other being in the universe, I would have been much more perfect than I am now if God had created me incapable of error. But I cannot deny that it's somehow a greater perfection for the universe as a whole that certain of its parts are not exempt from defect, while others are, rather than if they were all perfectly alike. I have no right to complain that God, who placed me in the world, didn't choose to make me the most perfect being. I should be content that, if He didn't give me the perfection of being incapable of error through the first method I mentioned, which relies on a clear and evident knowledge of everything I might deliberate on, He at least left in my power the other method, to firmly resolve never to make judgments where the truth isn't clearly known to me. Although I'm aware of the weakness of not being able to keep my mind focused on the same thought all the time, I can still, through attentive and repeated meditation, impress this resolution so strongly on my memory that I'll never fail to recall it whenever I need it, and I can develop a habit of avoiding error. Since being superior to error is the highest and most significant perfection of humanity, I believe I've achieved something considerable through today's meditation by discovering the source of error and falsity. It's clear that this source is nothing other than what I've just explained. As long as I restrain my will within the limits of my knowledge, forming no judgments except on matters that are clearly and distinctly presented to my understanding, I can never be deceived. Every clear and distinct conception is undoubtedly something, and as such, it can't come from nothing but must have God as its author. God, who is supremely perfect and cannot, without contradiction, be the cause of any error. Therefore, it's necessary to conclude that every such conception or judgment is true. Today, I've not only learned what to avoid to escape error, but also what to do to arrive at the knowledge of truth. I'll certainly reach the truth if I only focus my attention sufficiently on all the things I clearly and distinctly understand and separate these from the things I understand more confusedly and obscurely. This will be my diligent focus from now on. Meditation V. Of the essence of material things. and again of God, that he exists. There are still several other questions to consider about the attributes of God and my own nature or mind. I'll probably come back to these topics at some point, but for now, since I've figured out what must be done and what should be avoided to discover the truth, my main task is to try to move past the state of doubt I've been in for some time and find out whether anything can be known for sure about material objects. But before I consider whether these objects exist outside of me as I imagine them, I need to examine their ideas as they appear in my mind and determine which of them are clear and which are confused. First, I clearly imagine quantity, which philosophers often refer to as continuous, or the extension in length, breadth, and depth that belongs to this quantity, or rather to the object it represents. Additionally, I can divide this quantity into many different parts and assign various sizes, shapes, positions, and motions to each one. Moreover, I can assign different durations to each of these motions. I not only understand these things clearly when I think about them in general, but with a little more attention, I can also discover countless details about shapes, numbers, motion, and similar concepts. These are so obviously true and align so closely with my nature that when I discover them now, it feels less like learning something new and more like remembering something I already knew or noticing something that's always been in my mind but hadn't yet caught my attention. What's particularly important here is that I find countless ideas in my mind of certain objects that can't be considered mere negations, even though they may have no reality outside my thoughts. These ideas are not created by me, even though I have the power to think about them or not. They have true and unchanging natures of their own. For example, when I imagine a triangle, even though there may not be and may never have been such a figure anywhere in the universe outside of my thoughts, it's still true that this figure has a definite nature, form, or essence that is unchanging and eternal. This nature was not created by me, nor does it depend in any way on my thoughts. This is evident from the fact that various properties of the triangle can be proven, such as that its 3 angles equal 2 right angles, that its largest side is opposite its largest angle, and so on. Whether I like it or not, I now clearly see that these properties belong to the triangle, even though I wasn't thinking about them when I first imagined a triangle, and they, therefore, can't be said to have been invented by me. It's also not a valid objection to argue that maybe this idea of a triangle entered my mind through the senses after seeing triangular objects. I can imagine countless different shapes that could never have been objects of sense perception, and yet I can still prove various properties of their nature just as clearly as I can with the triangle. All these properties are undoubtedly true since I clearly understand them, so they must be something real and not mere negations. It's obvious that anything true must be something real, truth being identical with existence. And I've already shown that whatever is clearly and distinctly understood is true. Even if this hadn't been demonstrated, my mind is such that I'm compelled to believe whatever I clearly understand while I understand it. I remember that even when I was still strongly attached to the objects of the senses, I counted among the most certain truths those things I clearly understood related to shapes, numbers, and other topics in arithmetic and geometry, and pure mathematics in general. Now, if I can derive from my thoughts the idea of an object, and if everything I clearly and distinctly understand to belong to this object does, in fact, belong to it, might I also argue for the existence of God in the same way? It's certain that I find the idea of God in my mind, that is, the idea of a supremely perfect being, just as clearly as I find the idea of any shape or number. I know with equal clarity and distinctness that actual, eternal existence belongs to God's nature, just as much as everything provable about any shape or number truly belongs to the nature of that shape or number. So, even if all the conclusions from my previous meditations were false, I would still regard the existence of God as a truth as certain as any truth in mathematics. At first glance, this idea might seem to contain more sophistry than truth. Since I've always been used to distinguishing between existence and essence in other matters, it's easy to believe that existence can be separated from God's essence, and thus God can be conceived as not actually existing. However, when I think about it more carefully, it becomes clear that existence is just as inseparable from the essence of God as the idea of a mountain is from the idea of a valley, or as the fact that a triangle's 3 angles equal 2 right angles is inseparable from the essence of a rectilinear triangle. So, It's just as impossible to conceive of a God who is a supremely perfect being without existence or without some essential perfection as it is to conceive of a mountain without a valley. Although I can't conceive of a God without also conceiving of existence any more than I can conceive of a mountain without a valley, it still doesn't follow that there must be any actual mountain in the world just because I imagine one with a valley. Similarly, even if I conceive of God as existing, it doesn't seem to follow that God actually exists because my thoughts don't impose necessity on things. Just as I might imagine a winged horse, even though no such creature exists, I could perhaps attribute existence to God even though no God existed. However, these cases are not the same, and there's a fallacy hiding behind this objection. Just because I can't conceive of a mountain without a valley doesn't mean that there is any mountain or valley in existence. It only means that the mountain and valley, whether they exist or not, are inseparable from each other. On the other hand, because I can't conceive of God without also conceiving of existence, it follows that existence is inseparable from God, and therefore God really exists. This isn't because my thought imposes necessity on things, but rather because the necessity lies within the nature of God Himself. The necessity of God's existence determines me to think this way, as it's not within my power to conceive of a God without existence, just as it's not within my power to imagine a supremely perfect being lacking in absolute perfection, though I'm free to imagine a horse with or without wings. It shouldn't be objected here that it's necessary to admit that God exists after having supposed that He possesses all perfections, since existence is one of them, but that my original supposition wasn't necessary. This is like saying it's not necessary to think that all quadrilateral figures can be inscribed in a circle, because if I suppose this, I'd be forced to admit that a rhombus, which is a four-sided figure, can be inscribed in a circle, which is clearly false. This objection is irrelevant because although it may not be necessary for me to ever think of a deity, whenever I do think of a first and sovereign being and draw the idea of Him from my mind, I'm compelled to attribute to Him all kinds of perfections, even if I don't list them all or think of each one specifically. This necessity, that existence is a perfection, is enough for me to conclude that this first and supreme being exists. Just as it's not necessary for me to ever imagine a triangle, but whenever I choose to think of a figure with three angles, it's absolutely necessary for me to attribute to it the properties from which it's correctly inferred that its three angles equal two right angles, even though I might not think about this specific property at the time. Similarly, when I consider what figures can be inscribed in a circle, it's by no means necessary to suppose that all quadrilateral figures can be inscribed. In fact, I can't even imagine that being the case as long as I'm unwilling to accept anything in my thoughts that I don't clearly and distinctly understand. There's a huge difference between false assumptions like this and the true ideas that are innate to me, the most fundamental of which is the idea of God. I realize on many grounds that this idea of God is not something I made up. It doesn't simply depend on my thoughts, but represents a true and unchanging nature. First, because I can't conceive of any other being except God to whom existence necessarily belongs. Second, because it's impossible to conceive of two or more gods of this kind. And if one such God exists, it's clear to me that He must have existed from all eternity and will exist forever. Finally, because I understand many other attributes of God, none of which I can diminish or change. No matter what method of proof I use, it always comes back to this. Only the things I clearly and distinctly understand have the power to completely convince me. And although some of the things I understand in this way are obvious to everyone, while others are only discovered after careful investigation, once they are discovered, the latter are no less certain than the former. For example, consider a right-angled triangle. It's not immediately obvious that the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, but once understood, we are as firmly convinced of this truth as of any other. Likewise, if I weren't already burdened by prejudices and constantly surrounded by images of the physical world, I would know nothing more easily or quickly than the existence of God. Is there any truth clearer than the existence of a supreme being, or God, given that necessary and eternal existence belongs to His essence alone? Although it took a lot of deep thinking to understand this truth correctly, I'm now as certain of it as I am of anything I consider most certain. Moreover, I realize that the certainty of all other truths depends so completely on this knowledge that without it, It's impossible to know anything perfectly. Even though I'm naturally unable to resist the conviction of a truth when I have a clear and distinct understanding of it, my mind isn't capable of constantly focusing on the same thing. As a result, when I remember a past judgment without recalling the reasons behind it, new reasons may present themselves that could easily change my opinion if I didn't know that God exists. Without this knowledge, I would have no true and certain knowledge, just vague and fluctuating opinions. For example, when I consider the nature of a rectilinear triangle, it's crystal clear to me, as someone trained in geometry, that its three angles are equal to two right angles, and I find it impossible to believe otherwise while I'm focused on the proof. But as soon as I stop thinking about the demonstration, although I remember having clearly understood it, I might start doubting the truth of the demonstration if I didn't know that God exists. I might convince myself that I've been made in such a way that I could be deceived, even in matters that seem most evident and certain, especially when I remember that I've often considered things to be true and certain, only to later realize they were completely false. But once I discovered that God exists and observed that everything depends on Him, and that He's no deceiver, I inferred that everything I clearly and distinctly understand must be true. So even if I'm no longer focused on the reasoning behind a judgment, no opposing argument can be strong enough to make me doubt its truth, as long as I remember that I once clearly and distinctly understood it. My knowledge of it becomes true and certain. This knowledge extends to everything I remember having previously demonstrated, such as the truths of geometry and similar subjects. What could possibly make me doubt them? Will it be the idea that my nature is such that I can frequently be deceived? But I already know that I can't be deceived in judgments based on clear and distinct knowledge. Will it be that I once thought things were true and certain that I later found to be false? But I didn't have clear and distinct knowledge of those things, and, being unaware of the rule that assures the truth of a judgment, I was led to believe them based on weaker reasons than I originally thought. So, what further objection could there be? Could it be said that perhaps I'm dreaming, an objection I raised earlier, or that all my current thoughts are as baseless as dreams? But even if I were dreaming, the rule still applies that everything clearly presented to my mind is undeniably true. Thus, I see very clearly that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depends solely on the knowledge of the true God, so much so that before knowing Him, I could have no perfect knowledge of anything else. Now that I know Him, I have the means to acquire perfect knowledge of countless things, both regarding God Himself and other intellectual objects, as well as physical nature, at least in terms of pure mathematics, which do not concern themselves with whether or not such objects actually exist. Meditation 6. Of the existence of material things, and of the real distinction between the mind and body of man. Now, the only question left to consider is whether material things exist. Regarding this question, I at least know for sure that such things can exist, as long as they are the objects of pure mathematics, since I can conceive of them clearly and distinctly in that context. There's no doubt that God has the power to create everything I can clearly and distinctly conceive, and I've never considered anything impossible for Him to create, except when I encountered a contradiction in trying to conceive it correctly. Furthermore, the faculty of imagination that I have, and that I'm aware of using when I think about material things, is enough to convince me of their existence. For when I carefully consider what imagination is, I find that it's simply a certain application of the mind's cognitive faculty to a body that's immediately present to it, and that therefore exists. To make this clearer, I first note the difference between imagination and pure understanding, or conception. For example, when I imagine a triangle, I not only understand that it's a figure enclosed by three lines, but I also visualize these three lines as if they're present before me, using the internal application of my mind's focus, and this is what I call imagining. But if I want to think about a kiliogon, a thousand-sided figure, I can certainly understand that it's a figure made up of 1,000 sides, just as easily as I understand that a triangle is a figure made up of three sides. However, I can't imagine the 1,000 sides of a kiliogon the way I can the three sides of a triangle. I can't visualize them as if they're present before me. And even though, out of habit, I might vaguely imagine some figure when I think about a kiliogon, it's clear that this isn't really a kiliogon, because it's no different from what I would imagine if I were thinking of a myriagon, a 10,000-sided figure, or any other figure with many sides. This vague representation doesn't help me discover or understand the properties that distinguish a kilogon from other polygons. But if I consider a pentagon a five-sided figure, it's true that I can understand its shape just as easily as I can a kilogon, without the need for imagination. However, I can also imagine it by focusing my mind on its five sides and the area they enclose. In this way, I observe that imagination requires a special effort of the mind, which isn't needed for understanding or pure conception. And this special effort clearly shows the difference between imagination and pure understanding. I also note that this power of imagination that I have, insofar as it differs from the power of understanding, isn't necessary for my nature or essence, that is, for the essence of my mind. For even if I didn't possess imagination, I would still remain the same being that I am now. From this, it seems we can conclude that imagination depends on something different from the mind. I can easily understand that if some body exists with which my mind is closely connected, allowing it to focus on the body whenever it chooses, then it might be able to imagine physical objects. This mode of thinking would differ from pure understanding only in that, when the mind conceives of something, it turns inward and considers one of the ideas it has within itself. But when it imagines, it turns toward the body and contemplates in it some object that conforms to the idea that the mind either conceived by itself or received through the senses. I can easily understand, as I said, that imagination might work in this way if it's true that bodies exist. And since I can't find any other obvious way to explain imagination, I reasonably conjecture that bodies exist, though only with probability. Even though I carefully examine everything, I still don't find that I can necessarily infer the existence of any body from the distinct idea of physical nature that I have in my imagination. But I'm also accustomed to imagining many other objects besides the physical nature that's the subject of pure mathematics, things like colors, sounds, tastes, pain, and the like, although with less clarity. Since I perceive these objects much better through the senses, and they seem to reach the imagination through the senses and memory, I believe that to examine them more effectively, I should also consider what sense perception is, and investigate whether I can obtain certain proof of the existence of physical objects from the ideas apprehended by this mode of thinking. First, I'll recall the things I've so far believed to be true because I perceive them with my senses, and the reasons for my belief in their truth. Second, I'll examine the reasons that later made me doubt them. Finally, I'll consider what I should now believe about them. First, I perceived that I had a head, hands, feet, and other parts that made up my body, which I considered to be part of, or perhaps even the entirety of, myself. I also perceived that this body was surrounded by many other bodies, which could affect it in various ways, both beneficial and harmful. I recognized what was beneficial by a certain feeling of pleasure and what was harmful by a sensation of pain. Besides this pleasure and pain, I was also aware of hunger, thirst, and other bodily appetites, as well as certain physical inclinations toward joy, sadness, anger, and similar emotions. Outside of myself, I perceived not only the extension, shape, and movement of bodies, but also their hardness, heat, and other tactile qualities. Additionally, I perceived light, colors, odors, tastes, and sounds, the variety of which allowed me to distinguish the sky, the earth, the sea, and generally all other bodies from one another. Considering the ideas of all these qualities, which were presented to my mind and which alone I directly perceived, it wasn't unreasonable to think that I was perceiving objects entirely different from my thoughts, namely, the bodies from which these ideas came. For I was aware that these ideas were presented to me without my consent. I couldn't perceive any object, no matter how much I wanted to, unless it was present to the sense organ. And I had no power not to perceive it when it was present. And because the ideas I perceived with my senses were much more vivid, clear, and distinct in their own way than any of those I could create through meditation or find impressed on my memory, it seemed that they couldn't have come from me and must have been caused by some other objects. Since I had no knowledge of those objects beyond what the ideas themselves gave me, the most likely conclusion was that the objects resembled the ideas they caused. And because I also remembered that I had previously trusted the senses more than reason, and that the ideas I formed myself weren't as clear as those I perceived through the senses, and were often composed of parts of the latter, I was easily convinced that I had no idea in my mind that hadn't first passed through the senses. Nor was I entirely wrong in also believing that the body, which I had a special right to call my own, belonged to me more properly and closely than any other bodies. For indeed, I could never be separated from it as I could be from other bodies. I felt in it, and because of it all my appetites and emotions. And finally, I was affected by pain and the sensation of pleasure in its parts, and not in the parts of other bodies that were separate from it. But when I tried to understand why a sensation of pain would lead to a feeling of sadness, or why a sensation of pleasure would bring about joy, or why the strange sensation in my stomach that I call hunger would make me think of eating, and a dry throat of drinking, and so on, I couldn't find any explanation other than that I was taught by nature to think this way. After all, there's no apparent connection, at least none that I can comprehend, between the irritation in my stomach and the desire for food, any more than there is between the perception of something painful and the feeling of sadness that arises from it. And in the same way, it seemed to me that all the other judgments I had made about sensory objects were dictated by nature, because I noticed that these judgments were formed in me before I had any time to consider or evaluate the reasons behind them. However, over time, extensive experience gradually weakened my trust in my senses. I often observed that towers, which appeared round from a distance, looked square when viewed up close, and that large figures placed on top of those towers looked like small statues when viewed from below. And in countless other instances, I found errors in judgments based on external senses, and not only those based on external senses, but even those grounded in internal senses. For is there anything more internal than pain? And yet, I've been told by people who had their arm or leg amputated that they still sometimes felt pain in the part of the body they had lost. This led me to question whether I could be completely certain that any of my limbs were actually affected when I felt pain in them. To these grounds for doubt, I later added two more general ones. The first was that I believed I never perceived anything when awake that I couldn't also think I perceived when dreaming, and since I don't believe that the ideas I seem to perceive in my dreams come from external objects, I had no reason to believe that those I perceive while awake do either. The second was that since I didn't yet know the source of my existence, or at least assumed I didn't, I saw no reason to prevent me from being created by nature in such a way that I might be deceived even in matters that seemed to be most true to me. As for the reasons that had previously convinced me of the existence of sensory objects, I had no great difficulty finding suitable responses to them. Since nature seemed to incline me toward many things that reason made me reject, I thought I shouldn't trust its teachings too much. And although the perceptions of the senses weren't under my control, I didn't think that I should conclude from this that they came from something different from myself, as there might be some faculty within me, though still unknown, that produced them. But now that I'm beginning to know myself better and to understand more clearly the source of my existence, I don't think I should rashly accept everything the senses seem to teach, but at the same time, I don't think I should doubt them entirely. First, because I know that everything I can clearly and distinctly understand can be produced by God exactly as I understand it. It's enough that I can clearly and distinctly conceive of one thing apart from another to be certain that the two are different. After all, they can at least be made to exist separately by God's omnipotence, and it doesn't matter by what power this separation is made to force me to judge them as different. Therefore, just because I'm certain that I exist and that I don't observe anything else necessarily belonging to my nature or essence beyond being a thinking thing, I rightly conclude that my essence consists only in being a thinking thing, or a substance whose entire essence or nature is just thinking. And although I may have, or rather, as I'll soon say, I certainly do have, a body with which I'm very closely connected, nevertheless, because on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself as merely a thinking and non-extended thing, and on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of the body as only an extended and non-thinking thing. It's certain that I, that is, my mind, by which I am what I am completely and truly distinct from my body and can exist without it. Moreover, I find within myself various faculties of thinking that each have their own special mode. For example, I find that I have the faculties of imagining and perceiving, without which I can indeed clearly and distinctly conceive of myself as whole, but I cannot reciprocally conceive of these faculties without conceiving of myself, that is, without an intelligent substance in which they reside, because, in the way we understand them, or in the terms of the schools, Their formal concept includes some sort of intellection. Therefore, I understand that they are distinct from me as modes are distinct from things. I also notice other faculties, like the ability to move from one place to another, to take on different shapes, and the like, that cannot be conceived and cannot, therefore, exist without a substance in which they inhere. However, it's very clear that these faculties, if they really exist, must belong to some corporeal or extended substance, since in their clear and distinct concept there is some element of extension, but no element of intellection. Furthermore, I can't doubt that there is within me a passive faculty of perception, that is, of receiving and understanding the ideas of sensory things. But this faculty would be useless to me if there didn't also exist within me, or in something else, an active faculty capable of forming and producing these ideas. However, this active faculty can't be within me, as I am only a thinking thing, because it doesn't presuppose thought, and also because these ideas are often produced in my mind without my contributing to it in any way, and often even against my will. This faculty must, therefore, exist in some substance different from me, in which all the objective reality of the ideas produced by this faculty is contained formally or eminently, as I've mentioned before. This substance is either a body, that is, a corporeal nature in which is contained formally and in effect everything that is objectively and representationally in these ideas, or it is God himself or some other creature of a higher order than a body, in which the same is contained eminently. But since God is no deceiver, it's clear that he doesn't directly and immediately communicate these ideas to me, nor even through the intervention of any creature in which their objective reality is only contained eminently but not formally. Because he hasn't given me any faculty to discover this, but instead a very strong inclination to believe that these ideas come from corporeal objects, I don't see how he could avoid the charge of deception if they really came from another source or were produced by something other than corporeal things. Therefore, it must be concluded that corporeal objects exist. However, they may not be exactly as we perceive them with our senses, because our sensory understanding of them is often very obscure and confused. But at the very least, it's necessary to admit that everything I clearly and distinctly conceive as being in them, that is, generally speaking, everything included in the objects of speculative geometry, really exists outside of me. But when it comes to other things that are either specific, such as the size and shape of the sun, or are perceived less clearly and distinctly, like light, sound, pain, and so on, although they are highly uncertain and questionable, I still think that I can safely conclude that I have within me the means to reach the truth. This is based on the fact that God is not a deceiver and therefore, he hasn't allowed any falsehood in my beliefs that I don't also have the ability to correct. And first of all, it cannot be doubted that there is some truth in each of the teachings of nature. For by nature, understood generally, I now mean nothing more than God himself, or the order and disposition established by God in created things. And by my nature in particular, I mean the totality of everything that God has given me. But there's nothing that nature teaches me more clearly or more strongly than that I have a body that is harmed when I feel pain, and that needs food and drink when I experience hunger and thirst, and so on. Therefore, I shouldn't doubt that there is some truth in these sensations. Nature also teaches me through these sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on that I am not just housed in my body like a pilot in a ship, but that I am very closely connected to it, almost fused with it, to the point where my mind and body form a single unit. If this weren't the case, I wouldn't feel pain when my body is injured, because I am just a thinking thing, and I would perceive the injury only through my understanding, just as a pilot perceives by sight when some part of his ship is damaged. And when my body needs food or drink, I would be aware of this clearly, rather than through the confusing sensations of hunger and thirst. In reality, all these sensations of hunger, thirst, pain, and so on are nothing more than certain confused modes of thinking that arise from the union and apparent fusion of the mind and the body. Moreover, nature teaches me that my body is surrounded by many other bodies, some of which I need to pursue and others I need to avoid. And indeed, as I perceive different kinds of colors, sounds, smells, tastes, heat, hardness, and so on, I can safely conclude that there are corresponding variations in the bodies from which these different sensory perceptions come, even though they may not exactly resemble these perceptions. And since among these various sensory perceptions, some are pleasant and others unpleasant, there's no doubt that my body, or rather my whole self, as I am made up of both body and mind, can be affected in different ways, both beneficially and harmfully, by the bodies around me. However, there are many other beliefs that, although they seem to be teachings of nature, are not really so, but have gained a place in my mind through a habit of judging things without careful consideration. As a result, it can easily happen that such judgments contain errors. For example, I might believe that all space in which there is nothing to affect my senses is empty, that a hot body contains something exactly like the idea of heat in my mind, that a white or green body contains the same whiteness or greenness that I perceive, that a bitter or sweet body contains the same taste, and so on. I might also believe that the stars, towers, and all distant bodies are the same size and shape as they appear to my eyes, and so on. But to avoid any confusion, I need to define accurately what I mean by being taught by nature. Here, nature is taken in a narrower sense than when it refers to the totality of all things given to me by God, because in that broader sense, it includes much that belongs only to the mind, which I am not referring to when I use the term nature here, such as the notion I have of the truth that what's done cannot be undone, and all the other truths I grasp through natural light, without the help of the body. It also includes much that belongs only to the body, and which I am not including under the term nature here, such as the quality of heaviness and so on, which I am not discussing. Instead, I am reserving the term nature exclusively for the things that God has given to me as a being composed of both mind and body. But nature, in this sense, teaches me to avoid what causes me pain and to pursue what gives me pleasure and similar things. However, I don't find that it teaches me to draw conclusions about external objects from these different sensory perceptions without first carefully and thoughtfully considering them with my mind. For it seems to me that it is the mind's role alone, and not the combined whole of mind and body, to discern the truth in these matters. So, even though the impression a star makes on my eye is no larger than that from the flame of a candle, I don't experience any real or positive push to believe that the star is not larger than the flame. It's just that I've judged this way since I was young, without any rational basis. And even though when I approach a fire, I feel heat and even pain if I get too close, I have no reason to believe that there is something in the fire resembling the heat I feel, any more than that there is something like the pain I feel. All I have reason to believe is that there is something in it, whatever it might be, that causes these sensations of heat or pain in me. Similarly, even though there are spaces where I find nothing that affects my senses, I shouldn't conclude that these spaces contain no bodies. For I see that in this, as in many other similar matters, I've become accustomed to distorting the order of nature. These sensory perceptions, although given to me by nature merely to indicate to my mind what things are beneficial or harmful to the composite whole of which it is a part, and although sufficiently clear and distinct for that purpose, are nevertheless used by me as infallible rules for determining the essence of the bodies that exist outside of me, about which they can only provide me with the most obscure and confused knowledge. But I've already considered enough about how it happens that, despite the supreme goodness of God, there can still be errors in my judgments. However, a difficulty arises here concerning the things that I am taught by nature to pursue or avoid, as well as the internal sensations in which I seem to have sometimes detected error, and thus to be directly deceived by nature. For example, I might be deceived by the pleasant taste of some food that has been poisoned, leading me to eat the poison. In this case, however, nature can be excused because it simply leads me to desire the food for its pleasant taste, not the poison, which it doesn't know about. From this, we can conclude nothing more than that our nature is not all-knowing, which shouldn't be surprising since, as a finite being, my knowledge must also be limited. But we also often make mistakes in things that we are directly urged to do by nature, as in the case of sick people who desire food or drink that would be harmful to them. Here, it might be argued that the reason these people are deceived is that their nature is corrupted, but this doesn't solve the problem because a sick person is no less a creature of God than a healthy person, and therefore it is just as contrary to the goodness of God for the nature of the former to be deceitful as it is for the nature of the latter to be so. Just as a clock, made up of wheels and counterweights, still follows the laws of nature accurately even when it's poorly made and shows the wrong time, so too can the human body be considered as a kind of machine, made up of bones, nerves, muscles, veins, blood, and skin. Even if it had no mind, it would still exhibit the same involuntary movements as it does now, simply due to the arrangement of its parts. For example, if the body were suffering from dropsy, it would naturally experience thirst even though drinking would worsen its condition. It would instinctively move its nerves and other parts to take in water, thereby harming itself, just as it would naturally be stimulated to drink when it's healthy and needs hydration. Even though a clock that shows the wrong time can be said to be deviating from its intended purpose, we understand that the same clock, when viewed as a machine following the laws of nature, is still working as it should according to its design, even if it doesn't serve the purpose its maker intended. Similarly, we might think that the body's reactions are out of order when it feels thirst even though drinking would be harmful, but this understanding of nature is different from the more superficial idea we might have when comparing a sick person to a healthy one. The term nature here refers to something inherent in things, and thus possessing some truth. Even if we say that the nature of a dropsical body is corrupted when it feels thirst without needing to drink, in the context of the union of mind and body, this isn't just a label but a real error of nature, because the body feels thirst when drinking would actually be harmful. So, we need to consider why the goodness of God doesn't prevent human nature, in this union of mind and body, from being deceptive. To begin this examination, I first note that there's a significant difference between mind and body. The body is inherently divisible. Its parts can be separated, while the mind is entirely indivisible. When I consider the mind, that is, when I think of myself purely as a thinking being, I find no parts to divide. I clearly see that I am entirely one and indivisible. Even if a foot, an arm, or any other part of my body is cut off, nothing is taken from my mind. The faculties of willing, perceiving, and conceiving aren't parts of the mind but rather activities of the whole mind. On the other hand, physical things are quite the opposite. I can't imagine any physical object, no matter how small, that I can't easily divide in my thoughts. This divisibility of physical things is enough to teach me that the human mind or soul is completely different from the body, even if I hadn't already learned this from other sources. Next, I observe that the mind doesn't directly receive impressions from all parts of the body but only from the brain, or perhaps even from just one small part of it, where the so-called common sense resides. Whenever this part of the brain is affected in a particular way, it causes the same perception in the mind, even if other parts of the body are in different states, as many experiments have shown. I also observe that the nature of the body is such that none of its parts can be moved by another part slightly removed from it without the same movement affecting all the parts in between, even if the farthest part isn't moving at all. For example, in a cord that's under tension, if you pull one end, the other end won't move any differently than if you pulled an intermediate part of the cord while holding the far end still. Similarly, when I feel pain in my foot, physics teaches me that this sensation comes from the nerves spread throughout the foot. These nerves are like cords running from the foot to the brain. When the nerves are affected in the foot, they also affect the brain, where they originate, and cause a motion in the brain that makes the mind feel pain as if it were in the foot. But if these nerves are affected somewhere along their path, say in the leg, back, or neck, this same movement could still occur in the brain, leading the mind to feel pain in the foot, even though the foot isn't actually hurt. The same logic applies to all other sensations. Finally, I note that each movement in the part of the brain that directly affects the mind produces only one sensation in the mind. The most likely explanation is that this movement causes the mind to experience the sensation that is best suited and most useful for preserving the body's health. Experience shows that all the perceptions nature gives us are of this kind, and thus, there's nothing in these perceptions that doesn't demonstrate the power and goodness of God. For example, when the nerves in the foot are shaken more violently than usual, the movement travels through the spinal cord to the brain, signaling the mind to experience a sensation of pain in the foot. This sensation warns the mind to do everything it can to remove the cause of the pain, which is dangerous and harmful to the foot. It's true that God could have made it so that the same movement in the brain would cause the mind to become aware of something entirely different, perhaps making the mind conscious of itself as being in the brain, or somewhere between the foot and the brain, or perceiving some other object entirely. But none of these alternatives would have contributed as well to the preservation of the body as the sensation the mind actually experiences. Similarly, when we need a drink, The dryness in the throat moves the nerves, and through them, the brain. This movement causes the mind to feel thirst because there's nothing more useful at that moment than being made aware of the need for a drink to maintain health. The same applies to other sensations. It's clear, then, that even though God is supremely good, human nature, composed of both mind and body, can sometimes be misleading. If there's any cause that triggers the same movement in the brain as when the foot is injured, even if the foot itself isn't affected, the mind will naturally be deceived and feel pain in the foot. This deception occurs because the same movement in the brain creates the same sensation in the mind, and this sensation is more often caused by a foot injury than by something else. It's reasonable, then, for the mind to feel pain in the foot rather than in some other part of the body. And if the dryness in the throat sometimes results from a condition that doesn't actually require water for health, as in the case of a person with dropsy, it's still better for this sensation to be misleading in that rare instance than for it to be consistently deceptive when the body is in good health. The same logic applies to other cases. Certainly, this consideration is extremely helpful, not only in recognizing the errors my nature is prone to, but also in making it easier to avoid or correct them. Knowing that my senses more often show me the truth than falsehood in matters concerning the well-being of my body, and being able to rely on multiple senses to examine the same object, I can also use my memory to connect present knowledge with past experiences. Additionally, my understanding, which has already uncovered the causes of my errors, reassures me that I no longer need to fear encountering falsehood in what my senses present to me daily. I should dismiss all the extreme and ridiculous doubts I once entertained, especially the general uncertainty about whether I could distinguish sleep from being awake. Now, I can see a clear difference between the two states, particularly in how memory functions. In waking life, our memory can connect our experiences with each other and with the broader course of our lives, something it can't do with dreams. In truth, if someone appeared to me suddenly while I was awake and then disappeared just as quickly, like the images I see in dreams, I would have good reason to consider them a ghost or a figment of my imagination rather than a real person. But when I perceive objects where I can clearly determine where they come from, where they are, and when they appear, and when I can continuously connect these perceptions with the rest of my life, I can be perfectly sure that what I perceive happens while I am awake, not during sleep. I shouldn't doubt the truth of these perceptions at all, especially if, after consulting all my senses, memory, and understanding to examine them, none of these faculties contradicts the others. Since God is not a deceiver, it necessarily follows that I am not being deceived in these matters. However, because the demands of life often force us to make decisions before we have time for such careful examination, we must admit that human life is frequently prone to error regarding individual things. In conclusion, we must acknowledge the limitations of our nature.